Okay, thank you for joining us today for Black Males and Suicide live event. And my name is Tressica Hamilton. I'm the founder and CEO of the Sid Center and also the SidCenter.com website. And today, our guest speakers will be Temitayo Osinubi. He's a digital marketing specialist for ACCO brands. He's also the Sid Center's Hope Mentor. And also we have Reinette Arnold with us. She's a psychotherapist, a suicide expert, as well as the founder and CEO of the Empowerment Agency, which is a social and behavioral health firm. And she's also the executive director of GEMS, Inc., which empowers girls in the metro Atlanta area. Okay, so thank you both for being here.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Looking forward to the topic and discussing the issue that Black males are dealing with suicide. And first, I just wanted to talk about some of the risk factors of suicide.
So you want me to go ahead and lead it off in terms of risk factors?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so great questions in terms of risk factors. And this is something that I get a lot of parents who are looking to find out, like, how would I know whether or not my child would be at risk for suicide and things like that. So the biggest thing that I want to talk about is their exposure to trauma. I'm not going to talk about the typical risk factors in terms of just stressors, grief, and loss. Let's focus on trauma because that's something we rarely hear talked about in terms of our Black boys, especially in the Black community. So I like to think about the adverse childhood experiences, which is a quick assessment, few questions to ask in terms of what is the level of trauma or the experiences that individuals have experienced in those childhood, those formative developmental years. And so some of the main indicators it asks is there physical abuse? Is there sexual abuse? Are there individuals in the household who have been in and out of incarceration? Is there violence in the community? So as we think about those adverse childhood experiences and children's exposure to trauma, those are some of the risk factors that our Black boys are experiencing that no one is talking about. What's their exposure to stress? And how do you deal with stress? One of the big eye-opening incidents with me is I was doing a youth programming and we were talking about violence in the community. Well, we all know that violence happens in the community. However, we forget how close that it can happen to our children and our youth. And so when we were talking about violence on a meso level outside the community, these children start to talk about violence that happened right on their doorstep. They were in a small community and they said such and such got in a fight last night and the police were chasing them and they fell into our door and busted in our door. Oftentimes we forget that our children are exposed to so much, and if they don't have the ability to emotionally deal with this, to process it, to cope with it, to talk about it out loud, that places them at risk. Some other risk factors are going to be grief and loss. That could be the loss of a parent, the loss of a friend, the loss of a peer, anyone or anything that creates this sense of loss, this void in them, and they're not able to work through it or don't have that safe space. It puts them at risk for suicide. So those are some of the main things that we hear talked about in terms of our Black boys.
Thank you for sharing that, and especially about the part about them being exposed to violence in their own communities.
Absolutely.
And how that affects them. Okay, and let's discuss some of the risk factors to not the risk factors, some of the protective factors.
I love talking about this, especially with our community. So we go into the risk factors that puts them at risk, but how do we protect them, or what things need to be implemented so that we can help lessen the amount of stress that our Black and brown boys experience? When we look at protective factors, the main thing we want to do is, one, identify or allow them to have the space to say, this is what has happened to me. Not this is what is wrong with you, or blaming it on the individuals. Many of individuals are born into situations that are outside of their circumstances. But if we give them that safe space to say, this is what has happened to me, that empowers them and gives them the liberty to say, this is what I have experienced, and my experience is true, and it validates them. Some other things that we want to talk about is giving them access to appropriate mental health care. And really, I call it mental wellness. In order for us to stay well, whether it's mentally, physically, socially, we have to take care of our mental wellness. And so other protective factors are contributed to their physical well-being as well. Oftentimes this conversation is left off the table. We don't think about health and wellness and diet and physical activity and things like that. These things start to overlap one another. Many times our communities are filled with food deserts. There's not appropriate access to vegetables and well-balanced food. There's communities where you go to the grocery store because it's or the convenience store because it's the closest thing that's in the community, and these individuals are having access to chips and sodas and candy and sugar and things like that. That stuff impacts our overall functioning. And so even when I do critical incident and stress management, I immediately tell my individuals, eat a well-balanced diet, get your green leafy vegetables, stay away from sugar. Who is telling our youth this? Who's having this conversation in the brown and Black communities and thinking about what they have been exposed to as well? Increasing peer and social relationships. Do they have the opportunity to engage with other peers in a healthy manner? Do they know how to communicate well? Do they have socialization skills and opportunities that allow them to foster that among other youth? And also, do they have a safe space with any adults who they can talk to about some of these social issues, talk about their experience and their emotions? And one of the last things that I'm going to kind of go into is our own community and cultural norms that we've set into place. So oftentimes children grow up with this onus, children are to be seen and not heard. A child should stay in a child's place. Things like that are disempowering to our boys. And when we go deeper and we talk about specifically to boys are heard, you're not supposed to cry. You're a man up and things like that. Well, that doesn't help them be emotionally well and stable and process their emotions. They're taught from the jump that they actually shouldn't have emotions, that they should just man up, grit and bear it and keep moving. So those are some of the protective factors that I say are most important for our Black and brown boys.
Thank you for that awesome information, Reinette. And Temitayo, did you want to add anything?
Absolutely. And that was some really great information. It was a blessing just listening to it. But growing up as a Black male, a lot of times you're expected to learn through trauma. And I would say trauma is actually the preferred teaching method. And it's very problematic because, as she was just saying, you're supposed to man up and, don't cry or whatever. But like when certain things happen to you, you're supposed to be upset. Like if someone dies or if you get physically accosted or, these are things when tears would be appropriate, but you're told shut up, man up and don't do things like that. And so in a lot of ways, we've normalized trauma as a teaching method for boys. It's actually associated with masculinity. Like I can distinctly remember either before or after football practice, like we kept at the high school I was at, we kept a pair of boxing gloves in the locker room. And so whenever there was a problem or whatever, the coaches would let us circle up and fight it out. And a lot of times we called it chesting. We would just hit each other as hard as we could just to see who could take it. Right? That's not healthy at all. There's nothing healthy about that. But that machismo, that's what was presented, so that's what we gave them. And it's something that needs to be talked about. It's something that needs to be sort of shouted down because when I was younger, I was very antisocial because I was teased for being fat. I was teased because I had a funny sounding name, and I was mostly teased for my complexion. I was called, spook, tar, coal, African booty scratcher, all kinds of stuff. And so I would just, and of course I would get suspended or expelled. It got so bad that my mom I'm born and raised in Dayton, Ohio. My mom actually was contemplating moving down to Cincinnati because Dayton Public Schools had put me out like for good. Like, you can't come back here, like at all, period. And so I just wanted to be left alone. So I was overtly aggressive because it was a defense mechanism to just like stay away from me. Like, leave me alone. You've hurt me enough. Like, just don't come near me. First day of high school, I can't believe I'm even saying this. I'll regret this for the rest of my life. But finest girl in the class, fine woman. She hit me in the face with like a paper ball, just being playful. And I hit her with a book. And yeah, like, you're right, like just small transgression, but, you know, responded like going after a fly with an elephant gun because I was that frazzled. Yeah. And I, back then, you know, my mind frame was like, okay, if I make a pariah out of myself, people will leave me alone, and that will actually be a good thing, which is completely backwards, not healthy at all, but like that's where I was at the time. So talking about these things, getting it out in the open, learning how to deal with these and saying, okay, it's not okay to teach via trauma. It's not okay to be antisocial because you want to be left alone. It's something that has to happen.
Most definitely. We definitely need to have more conversations in the Black community about this topic, and especially the part about the teacher. Because I wonder if they're still going on in the schools and they talk about toxic masculinity, and some of that fuels that, and it's mostly attributed to Black males. So we definitely need to have more conversations around that and how to actually help kids to have positive and healthy development, because that is not healthy. And also, one of the things too with children, especially the younger children that are under 11, because they're still developing, they don't understand things like adults do. And so I want to talk about how to discuss suicide with the younger children. A lot of parents are concerned about that Momo challenge that was out in social media and how it would affect their child. And a lot of parents were thinking that if they talk to the child about suicide, that will put thoughts of suicide in the child's head, which is not true. So let's talk about how to talk to suicide to the younger kids to help them understand.
Awesome, great question. And so I get this a lot when I go out into the community and do trainings. And I'm doing trainings among law enforcement, first responders, faith-based communities, parents, and clinicians. And this is something that I often get. And so what I say to parents is, it's a little bit of humor in this. Remember when we did not talk to our kids about sex education? Don't talk to them about sex, because if we talk to them about sex, they'll start having sex. And my question is, were they already having sex? And people are like, yeah, most of them were. Same thing with suicide. It is our priority and a benefit to us as a community to start engaging our families around the topic of suicide. I don't go especially based on age, but more so the level of maturity. So I want to start there first, because sometimes some students, some boys can be more mature in terms of the conversation and dialogue. And that could be based on their experience or how relative mental health as well as suicide is to them. I've had kids from the ages 5 up until 18 who have lost friends to suicide. So that conversation can be very different. However, I will say this, it's up to our parents to introduce this conversation. It's harmful to our youth when something such as 13 Stories, the suicide docuseries that was on Netflix, or the Momo Challenge, is the first introduction to suicide to our youth, because they often walk away from things like that not feeling comfortable being able to discuss it. So if we can have an age appropriate or maturity level appropriate conversation talking about suicide, you normalize the conversation, not the behavior. Some of the things that I suggest parents ask is, have you ever heard the term suicide before? What comes to mind when you hear the term suicide? Have you ever heard your friends or anyone else say anything about suicide? So it doesn't put the lens specifically on them. It focuses on the topic at hand so that they can have a general conversation. And the main priorities that we want to stick out in that conversation is, have you had thoughts of suicide? If you did, who would you tell? And this is how we would get you help and connected to resources and services. Data shows that when people contemplate suicide, regardless of the age, they often are looking for someone to talk to about it. They feel so isolated and alone and so much emotional pain. And so when we think about our youth who aren't able to verbalize what exactly is going on, and you add it with the layer of, I'm talking about suicide. How do I tell my parent or my loved one or my sister or my friend that I'm thinking about killing myself or harming myself? If we open the door to that conversation and we say, if you ever have any thoughts of harming yourself or killing yourself or suicide, whatever makes you feel comfortable, but you want to specifically say, if you say harm, you want to go back and overlay it with, are you thinking about killing yourself? Because you want to be that specific. It's a difference between self-harm and actual suicide. You want to make sure that they know that, yes, you can talk to me about it and we can connect you to resources, services, and support. And also making sure they have a trusted adult. One of my biggest advice to parents is, if that child does not name you as that trusted adult, be okay with that and identify a parent or an adult who you are okay with, who they can speak to. Because sometimes children, for whatever reason, don't feel as if their parents are that first source of support who they want to talk to. But as long as they have someone they can engage with and talk to, who's a trusted advisor and support and parental person who's able to offer help and offer that connection. That's my biggest advice to parents, but we gotta have the conversation. If we don't, the community, the world, their peers is gonna have that conversation for us.
Absolutely. And this is very deeply personal for me because I actually lost one of my good friends to suicide. When was this? I graduated in 2002, so this had to be 2006 or 7. Ernie committed suicide. I had a suicide attempt in my sophomore year of high school. My cousin just attempted suicide a couple years back. And the thing to really get across to someone who's in crisis or who's in pain is that suicide is a permanent solution to a temporary problem. Right? Like, I know it doesn't feel like it right now, but this too shall pass. Like, I promise you it will. Heartbreaks, you'll get over them. Depression doesn't last always. And if you will just work through this with me, I promise you that there's light at the end of the tunnel, or there's another side to it, whatever cliche you want to use, but it won't always be like this. Right. And if you go through with this, that's a permanent solution to a temporary problem. And it's especially, like, for me, I didn't have a lot of positive Black male role models. I didn't have a lot of, and the people who were role models, I didn't necessarily feel comfortable. I felt comfortable with them to an extent, but not like, they were cool, but they weren't cool. Like, if you know what I mean. So it's, like you said, having a safe space, having someone you can talk to is very important because, it was, and again, going back to my antisocial tendencies, it's very isolating. It is not something, that's not a water cooler conversation. Like, hey, what did you do this weekend? Oh, I thought about jumping off a bridge. How about you? Like, that's not something you can just, come out and discuss with someone. So getting across how they're feeling, why do you feel that you need to take it this far? What is it that you feel you will be solving or gaining by taking this course of action? Especially like when they're young and formative, the outlook can be kind of bleak, like I'm from the west side of Dayton. The way Dayton was traditionally segregated, white people are on the east side, Black people are on the west side. And the west side of Dayton has deteriorated dreadfully. They PBS did a Frontline documentary on Dayton, Ohio. It was so bad because they used to call Dayton Little Detroit, because we had a big GM plant here and we had a lot of manufacturing here. So when GM went under, it took a third of the west side of Dayton with it. Like, they're still like going through certain neighborhoods, Five Oaks, Cornell Heights, every other house is boarded up. and it's crackheads squatting in it and all this kind of stuff. So it can be very, very hopeless, and just the outcome is bleak. But you gotta show them like, yo, I was there. I'm literally from the same neighborhood as you, been through it. I know it's not pretty, but I promise you that there's greatness in you. There's more happiness that you could ever know, and if you can just get through this rough patch, like, you are so fly. And I know you're fly because I'm fly, and you're flyer than me because I made you. So it's you just got to get through this, and it'll be fine. So just kind of level setting that and letting them know, like, look, this, I know it seems like it'll be this way always, but it won't. It just won't.
Yeah. One of the things that I'll add when I talk to individuals about suicide, regardless the age, I never get into this power struggle about taking suicide off the table, because for them, suicide is the only option. They're in emotional pain. They are suffering. They are isolated, and nothing has seemed to help up until this point. And so think about someone who may feel as if they don't have any other choice. If you take that option of suicide off the table, some people may respond with, oh yeah, you're not going to take this final choice from me. If I'm going to have anything under control, I have the right to take my life. So we don't want to get into that power struggle, but we do acknowledge the fact that, hey, you are in emotional pain. I understand that this hurts, and I want to find out what has happened to you and help walk with you through this process so that you can get the help that you need. Because as you stated, there's light at the end of the tunnel. There is another side to this. And I also add that for the individuals who have attempted suicide, once they get past that point, for those who survive, they often say that they regret the act of suicide or attempting suicide, or they didn't think that they could see a way out. They didn't know that there were other options. They didn't know that there were people who they could talk to. They just were in this tunnel and this funnel of isolation and emotional pain. So that's why having that conversation is so important, especially connecting individuals to therapists and mentors who look like them, who can offer that support. So again, that they are empowered as our Black and brown boys. It's so important. This looks very different from other races and ethnicities, except the fact that the data and statistics are starting to mimic other races and ethnicities. There was a time where we said in our community, in our Black and brown communities, Black people don't kill themselves. Well, that wasn't true then, and it definitely isn't true now. Matter of fact, I want to give some data from the CDC to talk about how important this is that we have this conversation. Suicide is currently the third leading cause of death among Black boys between the ages of 15 to 24. Third leading cause of death between the ages of Black boys 15 to 24. And then around Black boys ages 5 to 11, it's doubled over the past 20 years. So whenever I look at these data and statistics, I often go back to the Surgeon General, who in 1999 declared that suicide was a public health emergency. Now, one of the limitations of our communities and why it's impacted us, I think, even more gravely, when Dr. David Satcher, who is an African-American male, brilliant man, who said, this is a problem. The suicide rates and statistics are staggering, and it's impacting our communities. And he didn't say just white communities. And I argue that he says he didn't differentiate between the two, because when you look at the data and statistics, you saw an increase even back up to 1994. This came out back in 1999. So as we think about this, the data has to catch up for them to clean it and report out. So when he declared it was a public health emergency, again, you go into our communities, and if anyone knows about grants and funding, dollars are dropped down from the federal government. Well, it's up to us in our communities to advocate at our state level to say, hey, we need those dollars. If our Black and brown people are walking around saying, hey, you know what, suicide doesn't happen in my community, who do you think got those dollars? Well, they went to other communities. And so they got education, they got curriculums, they got prevention materials, they got strategies, they got coalitions. However, we're just now catching up to speed, and we're still very far behind the 12 ball. When I'm talking about suicide, I say the 12 ball because every 12 minutes someone dies by suicide. So we have to get ahead of this. We have to voice how important this is, even among our Black and brown people, that we are dying by suicide, especially our boys are dying by suicide. And we have to sit at the table. One of the reasons that I decided to really start to hone my career and specialize towards the suicide prevention piece is because when I was sitting at these tables, no one looked like me. And we're in Metro Atlanta, and I'm looking around at the panel, and I'm like, okay, no one looks like me, but we're talking to all these Black and brown people. And so I will never forget, I was at Georgia Piedmont College, and it was a room of beautiful Black and brown people, men and women, boys and girls, and they're looking at us. They hear us, but they don't hear us. And you can always tell when someone hears you. And they had this beautiful quilt that had these faces of individuals who had died by suicide. I remember looking over my right shoulder and not seeing a face of color. And so I said to them, I know that most of the people who come and talk to you about suicide don't look like you. I know this beautiful quilt does not look like you. However, it is impacting our communities. And I gave them some of the same data and statistics that I just gave you all. We have to have a reality check on this and get a grip of it and start having the conversation. So again, Treska, I appreciate you for having this opportunity to really talk to our communities and specifically talking about our Black and brown boys.
Thank you for that, and thank you for the data too, and just the information. Especially with people, a lot of people were surprised to learn that children, Black boys as young as 5 years old, never attempted suicide. And I remember one man asking if they could figure out how to, commit suicide, how come they couldn't ask for help? But the child doesn't have the same thought process as an adult. They're still developing.
Yeah.
And so we do have children, Black boys as young as 5 years old.
And it's so isolating. I think that people don't realize how significant the impact of emotional pain can be. If I logged into this webinar today and I had a black eye, you all would look at me and say, oh, wow, she has a black eye. She looks like she is hurt. That must have hurt. You would express a lot of empathy towards me, compassion. Someone may want to, walk me into the police station to help file a report. But if I show up like this and I'm pretending and masking that I'm okay, you don't know emotionally that I'm broken, that I'm hurting, that I'm suffocating, that I'm suffering in silence. And so that's what a lot of individuals are doing. They're walking around barely making it, feeling as if no one cares. So yeah, it's hard for them to open their mouths and say, hey, I need help, especially when we're talking about the topic of suicide, because remember, Black people don't kill themselves. Or I'm a man, I'm supposed to be tough. How dare I say, you know what, this is hurting me and I want to kill myself. What Black men or boys walk around saying, I'm hurt. We teach them to be strong, to man up. That isn't even in their vocabulary to say I'm hurt. Matter of fact, most men and women, especially in our community, go through counseling to learn how to say, no, I'm not angry, I'm hurt, because that's the root of it. Yeah, so it's important.
It certainly is. And just like I was telling some of the boys, warriors have wounds that need healing.
Yeah.
They're told to man up, they still get hurt, and they have the right to express their feelings and to let people know that they're hurting.
Right.
And so much of it is disguised as anger when they're really hurting. So thank you for that. And I just want to see if our guests have a couple of questions before we end. If you have any questions, you can unmute yourself.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, this is Felice, and I have a question just about PTSD and the impact that, individuals who may have experienced some type of war experiences, and then they come back, and then, they may be exhibiting signs of anger, etc., and the way that even impacts the whole family. And so I don't know if you guys have worked with families who, like I said, may be experiencing PTSD and even be, I guess, collateral damage, if that's appropriate in terms of, you know, how does this impact these little boys and men who are in the house with a loved one who is, you know, dealing with PTSD?
Yeah, so I'll say from my experience, PTSD is definitely real, especially in our communities, whether it's from war or any other type of trauma that individuals have experienced. It creates even more or added layer of damage, because not only is that father suffering and impacted by trauma, but then you have the family's exposure to this situation as well. And so especially if that individual isn't connected to services and support, we've seen it come out in many dysfunctional ways. We've seen individuals go off in rages, or them have flashbacks and run around with weapons, or incidents of violence and things like that. And that person themselves, we know that in terms of data and statistics, those who are veterans or active military have an even higher rate of suicide. And so if all of that is going on at home with this one person, it impacts the entire family unit. So that's why it's so important for whatever is going on in the family, that that person reaches out for help, because it's going to trickle down in some shape, form, or fashion. We see this with boys saying, my father exhibits X, Y, and Z, or my mom does this and that, and so forth. It is impacting them. And if we don't get them help as a family and wrap services and support around them, it's going to have a grave and even more detrimental impact. So my recommendation would be to connect that family unit to services and offer resources and support. In my practice, if an individual shows up and I find out that they have family members in the household, even though I may not be treating that entire family unit, I will provide additional resources and support to help that family, because I'm thinking from a holistic ecological perspective. It's a person in the environment, and that first environment and the most proximate environment, what's closest to them, is their family unit, where they're going to have the most impact. So we want the entire family to be healthy and whole.
Right. And to just to piggyback on that, as Reinette said at the beginning of the webinar, PTSD doesn't always take the form of military. It could take the form of, you just saw somebody get shot in front of you and you're 9 years old. And so I've never been in the service, and I don't think I've ever had PTSD, but a good friend of mine who's in Atlanta, he was active military, and when he got back, he was diagnosed with PTSD. And what he would do is that he would clench his jaw and he would grind his teeth. So he started to have dental problems, because he was grinding down his mouth, because he was like, he wouldn't even know he was doing it. He would just clench his jaw. And so Lex, my dude Lex Kelly out in Latonia, what he ended up doing is you got to talk about self-care, as well as, you know, being in relationship with other people, because what he does is he'll go like to the sauna and the sweat lodge. Just like he took me there once. I may go back. It was like 120 degrees, but it was nice. You know, you sweat out the toxins, and they put like the lavender and different scents on the rocks, so it smells nice. But anyway, you really need to have conversations about self-care, what's disturbing you, as well as bring certain behaviors to the person's attention and a non-threat. Because like you say, he didn't even know he was grinding his teeth. Like his dentist had to point it out to be like, yo, what's good with your molars? Why are they ground down like that? He's like, huh? He's like, yeah, your teeth are ground down. Like, what happened? He's like, oh, I don't know. So it might be just a defense mechanism that they're not even aware of.
So glad that you brought up the topic of self-care, and this is something we often, again, don't talk about in our community. And I often say, if we wait until we have the conversation or need to have the conversation about self-care, we've waited too late. As parents, as adults, as professionals, as community members, we really need to start modeling proper self-care and having people to implement self-care plans. Now, self-care has kind of turned into lately like a commodity, this whole marketing strategy to get people go to expensive spas and things like that and vacations. And it's not necessarily that. That's a part of it, but that's not the end all be all. Self-care has basic principles. You want to look at your health and wellness, your financial status, your situation in terms of how that goes, because we know that when finances aren't right, oftentimes the home front isn't right. You want to look at your social, who's connected to you that is pouring into you and not stressing you out all the time or not draining you. You want to look at these things and identify, how do I take proper care of myself? Whether it's setting boundaries with people and saying, okay, these people are healthy for my mental wellness. These people are, help me stay balanced and I socialize with them, or are they pulling resources and stuff from me? Are they bullying me? So again, when we're talking about kids, are they bullying me? Are they teasing me? Are they taking my items that my parents have bought for me? Are they using me? Is it peer pressure that they're trying to get me to do something that I know I shouldn't be doing? And then when we think about health and wellness, are those children exercising? Are they engaged in anything productive? Are they getting outside and taking walks outdoors? How's their physical health? Are they overweight and things like that? We really have to start looking at that, because all of that has an overall impact on our ability to care for ourselves and have a total mind, body, and soul wellness. How do our youth react? Because life is going to happen. Stressors are going to occur. So we need to teach them at an early age how to cope and deal with stress. Stress is something that's going to happen. There can be positive forms of stress as well as negative forms of stress. We have to teach our youth that when things are getting too overwhelming, how do I calm myself down? How do I process it out? Who do I go to? How do I relax? What are some stress reduction techniques? Am I meditating? Things like that are free, which is what I usually go towards first. Let's find out what the free solutions and protective factors are so that we can implement those among our communities and our families so that we have no excuse to practice proper self-care. And we should be doing it as a family unit so that it trickles down, it reinforces. And so not only are the parents teaching the youth, but oftentimes my families who come to me, the youth will say to the parent, I see you're getting stressed, Mom. Let's do our deep breathing exercises and things like that are just something you can do in that moment to help you relax, because we all know life has challenges. So we got to be able to cope with it.
Exactly. Did anyone else have any questions?
I do have a question. I know I came in on kind of late. Just a comment. I don't know if you guys touched on the impact of social media, and if that has any impact on our Black and Brown youth in terms of suicide, making a choice or decision to die by suicide or even attempt suicide.
Yeah, we mentioned it in terms of the Momo challenge, but even in terms of things like Facebook and Snapchat, I'm often, when I reflect back on the impact social media has on people in general, I'm so thankful that social media was not available when I was a youth and in school, right? Because when we think about factors such as bullying and kids teasing other kids and whatnot, bullying has always happened. However, at least, and I'll say back in the day, because I feel like this is a back in the day moment for me, when kids were bullied, they had some reprieve. Like, it may have happened between 8 to 2. At 2 o'clock, you would go home, get off the bus, or your mom or dad would pick you up. And then you were loved on, you had a break. You could go in your own house or in your room or go get with your friends and just kind of hang out and decompress. Now with social media, these kids have 24/7 access to you, and they are using every method that they have to torture and to torment and to tease these kids. And so when you have that bullying factor, there's no break from it, and it can be very overwhelming and very detrimental to your social and emotional well-being. The other thing that we realize that social media has a great impact on is individuals, and especially youth, competing. They're seeing such and such with the Jordans, with the video games, with the nice cars and things like that. Some of it may be real, a lot of it is not real. However, if there's no one to help balance that out, or for you to realize that all of this stuff that you are seeing on social media, even along celebrity, youth, and young adults, is not real, it can have a grave impact on their anxiety and depression and their self-identity and self-concept. So again, these conversations have to be had. Another thing that I think has a grave impact is in terms of the music selection. A lot of our youth listen to music that has some pretty intense and I'll say not good, that's the only word that I can think of that's appropriate, just not so good lyrics. If you really sit down and listen to the lyrics, they're not productive, and youth aren't able to critically think to say, okay, is the things that this person is rapping about or singing about even real? Does he or she really come from this type of background? And so one of the things that I do in some youth groups is I actually help do some of the history in terms of some of the artists who they love. Who is this individual artist who you're working with? And so they find it very funny when they get an artist who really didn't grow up with that type of swag or that type of background and this very hood or thuggish type of environment, but they're selling it to our youth. So we have to teach our youth how to be brighter and smarter and how to protect what comes or what goes into their soul, I'll say, so to speak, because I do believe the things that we put in front of us, whether it's in front of our vision or our ears, that it does seep into us. So we have to be more protective over that and teach them how to filter stuff out. I always say, I love good music. I work out to all that music and whatnot. However, I also pour into myself more healthy and balanced and motivational and spiritual things so that I can balance it out and not just live 24/7 with a lot of detrimental stuff to myself.
Right. And I'll answer that question in a kind of a roundabout way. And I'm really glad the sister just talked about competition, because to be male, especially a Black male, is this never ending cycle of dick measuring and targeting, right? Because when men get together, we measure each other's dicks. Like, that's what we do. It's not right. It's not fair. That's what happens.
Thank you.
And unfortunately, a tried and true strategy for making yourself appear as though you have a big dick to make somebody else look like they have a small dick. Right. And so we target each other. Like, that's what we do. We ferret out the weak link. We target that person. We make their lives a living hell, because by doing so, we're taking attention off of ourselves. And I've seen grown men in their 50s and 60s who still exhibit that same behavior. It's very unfortunate. And so what I would say, looping it back to social media, a lot of the times the intensity and the viciousness of the competition comes from wanting to impress someone, either their circle of friends or romantic interests, and just letting them know, like, yo, being unwell ain't sexy. It's just not. like being emotionally stable, being able to talk through your emotions, being able to process things, that's attractive. It is. Not knowing what's going to happen next because you on one, that ain't sexy. So social media is definitely, like you said, it took behaviors that were an issue before and it just magnifies them. And you just have to know that men judge each other and we target each other, and that's just something that we do. And I'm not making excuses. I'm not saying it's right. I'm just making you aware of, like, that's what it is to be male. A lot of being a man is not being a bitch. Like, that's 90% of it right there. Again, very unfair, very unhealthy, toxic masculinity, but it's something that we deal with and it's something that we do to each other. So making sure that they have a really strong, positive role model, as well as a really strong sense of self and knowing what's actually attractive and what's not attractive. Because I have done some stupid things trying to impress a girl. Later on, I figured out that, okay, yeah, she thinks you're stupid because that was stupid. So, having those conversations and really talking through it, I think will go a long way in quelling a lot of that.
Yeah, I will say, so Temitayo, thank you so much for bringing that realness to the conversation, because again, which is why we needed especially a Black male in this conversation who can shed light on some of just the realness and things that take place among men. And, you know, men know men, while we know some of the social issues in terms of the cultural nuances and context and what that self-concept and identity and what goes on, so eloquently stated. We needed a man to bring that to the table. So we thank you for that.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Yeah. And other parents are going to listen to this, so they need to hear that as well. So that's good.
Thanks for keeping it real, Temitayo. Okay, and are there any other questions? Okay. So we'll wrap this up. And thank you so much, Temitayo and Reinette, for being amazing guest speakers. And I want to thank everyone for joining us for our discussion on Black males and suicide. And this is part of our Souls of Black Men series. This is part 1. And the Souls of Black Men series will be discussing issues affecting the lives of Black men or Black males. And I just want to thank you so much for all the awesome information you've provided and keeping it real and helping people who will be watching this and listening to it to learn more about how suicide is affecting our Black males.
Thanks
and
so
again,
much for having us.
Yeah, I appreciate you both. And did you want to add any last comments, Temitayo or Reinette?
You're a rock star, Tresca. It was
Thank
a
you, Temitayo.
pleasure to have a small, teeny part in guiding the greatness that is you. This is absolutely necessary. We need somebody who's willing to gather like-minded individuals and have these conversations. So thank you so much for giving your gifts and letting us be a part of it.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely, I echo that. And I'm so proud of you. And I love seeing the information coming out, because it is an area that we really need to hone in on and talk about some of the issues related to our Black and brown boys. So I appreciate it and I thank you.
Thank you, my pleasure. And again, we have Temitayo Osinubi. He's a digital marketing specialist for ACCO Brands. He's also the Sid Center's Hope Mentor, and he's my mentor as well. And also we have Reinette Arnold. She's a psychotherapist and a suicide expert. She's the CEO of Empowered, the Empowerment Agency. And your website is empowered-
Yeah, it's www.empowered-consultants.com. So look us up, check us out, send us information, and we'll respond back to you.
Thank you. And again, I want to thank Temitayo and Reinette for being amazing guest speakers. You gave a lot of great information. So just thank you so much for being here. And thank you to our guests who showed up. And again, this is Tressica Hamilton. I'm the CEO of the Sid Center and the SidCenter.com. And we're focused on disrupting the school to prison pipeline for Black males. Okay, and thank you again, and take care, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.